Amid smoking ruins, cities turned to dust, and millions of hungry and displaced people, Germany awoke to a new reality. Without Hitler, without a homeland, and without a certain future, the survivors learned to live in a collapsed world where each day was a struggle to eat, endure, and rebuild. This is the story of how real life was after the death of the Führer. The day after the Führer. On the 30th of April of 1945, when Adolf Hitler pulled the trigger in his bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, the myth of the millennial Reich collapsed in a matter of hours. Outside, the city burned like a smoking corpse, and the news of his death, far from bringing clarity, left Germany plunged into a power vacuum and into chaos that seemed infinite. The regime that had promised glory had crumbled into a mixture of smoke, dust, and silence. What remained was a devastated country, without direction, without a leader, and with a population that oscillated between stupor and the mere need to survive one more day. The last days of April and the 1st of May of 1945 were not a clean transition from war to peace, but a liminal space where nothing was defined. The fronts still fought with brutality, the Allied armies advanced without rest, and millions of civilians were trapped in cities that were nothing more than rubble. In the streets of Berlin, neighbors learned through rumors, through muffled voices, or through Soviet soldiers shouting in strange languages that the man who had dominated their lives for 12 years was dead. There were no ceremonies nor official speeches that marked that historical moment. The collapse was too quick and too brutal. In the following hours, the Nazi machinery tried to maintain a facade of continuity. There was talk of a new government under Karl Dönitz, of continuing the fight from the north, of negotiating an armistice in the west while containing the Red Army in the east. But all were empty illusions, hollow words that crashed against reality. Germany was encircled, its communications fragmented, its troops exhausted and demoralized. The order to resist until the end, repeated to the point of obsession for years, had led entire cities to become meaningless defensive ruins. Now, without Hitler, that slogan evaporated like smoke. The German soldiers who still remained on the front lines fought without understanding why. Some did it out of fear of the officers, others out of simple inertia, others still because surrendering to the Soviets was almost equivalent to death. The last battles, fought after the suicide of the Führer, were of absurd ferocity. Young recruits, elderly men of the Volkssturm, and remnants of entire divisions faced armies that advanced with overwhelming superiority. In some sectors, the news of Hitler's death had not even arrived, and the war continued to be fought as if he were still alive. For the civilian population, the impact was ambiguous. There were those who breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that finally surrender and the end of bombings might come. Others felt panic. If Hitler was dead, who would protect them from the hatred of the victors? In towns and villages, rumors mixed with the distant roar of artillery and with the passage of columns of refugees. Each day brought contradictory news. Some swore that a new miracle weapon was about to change the course of the war. Others spoke of secret negotiations with the Americans. The truth was that nobody knew anything, and in that void, ordinary people clung to the only thing they could: survival. The Germany of May of 1945 was a landscape of physical and spiritual ruins. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, or Berlin were nothing more than blackened skeletons crossed by avenues of rubble. Train stations were full of families fleeing from the arrival of the Red Army, carrying what little they could in carts or on their backs. Exhausted women with children in their arms walked for days seeking refuge, while columns of prisoners of war and forced laborers liberated by the Allies wandered along the roads. The social structure that had held Germany together during the regime had dissolved in a matter of days. In the cities, the feeling was that of an end of the world. The shops were empty, the improvised markets in the streets offered only rotten potatoes or hard bread. Running water functioned intermittently, and electricity was an unattainable luxury in many neighborhoods. The stench of corpses trapped under the rubble and of dead horses in the streets permeated the air. In the midst of this scenario, the news of Hitler's death was barely one more note in a symphony of destruction. Nazi propaganda had repeated ad nauseum that without Hitler there would be no Germany, that he was the embodiment of the nation. And yet after his death, what emerged was not nothingness, but a country forced to look at itself in the mirror of its ruins. The speeches of greatness had ended. What remained was hunger, violence, foreign occupation, and the need to survive without certainties. Ordinary Germans found themselves naked before reality. They had followed a man into the abyss, and now they had to find a way to keep living without him. In the east, the arrival of Soviet troops was experienced like a storm. The accounts of those days are steeped in fear, looting, rapes, summary executions. For many Germans, the fall of Nazism also meant the beginning of another form of suffering. In the West, under British and Americans, the atmosphere was different, although no less difficult. Strict rationing, military control, curfews. The surrender did not mean immediate peace, but the entrance into an uncertain stage in which the word occupation dominated every aspect of life. The day after Hitler was not a dawn of hope, but an extension of the night. Families searched for the missing among improvised lists in churches or bulletin boards. The hospitals, overwhelmed, cared for the wounded with the little they had. The trains, when they worked, carried more corpses than passengers. The war had ended on paper with the dictator's death, but in reality it still permeated every corner of the country. Even in the most absolute defeat, some tried to maintain the fiction of a future Reich. Officers met in dark basements, speaking of reorganizing divisions, of new offensives that would never come. But they were empty gestures, shadows of a regime that had already been devoured by its own megalomania. Most Germans instead wondered how to get the next meal, how to protect the children from the cold, how to survive a war that refused to die completely. The figure of Hitler at that moment was no longer that of a leader, but of a ghost. For many, his death was simply the confirmation that they had been dragged into destruction by a man who had deceived them. For others, especially the most fanatical, it was a devastating blow, an impossible void to fill. Blind loyalty had been reduced to ashes, and the only thing that persisted was the bitter memory of the ruins. On the 8th of May of 1945, when Germany signed the unconditional surrender, barely 8 days had passed since the death of the Führer. But those 8 days felt like an eternity. The country went through in that brief span a brutal transformation, from war power in desperate resistance to defeated and occupied nation. What happened between the afternoon when Hitler took his life and the dawn when surrender was sealed was the X-ray of the collapse of an entire society. Real life after Hitler did not begin with reconstruction, nor with the speeches of the victors. It began with the silence of the ruins, with hunger in the stomach, with fear of the future, and with the certainty that everything known had crumbled. It was a grey dawn in a country where nobody celebrated, and where the only certainty was that the worst was still to come. Chaos in the streets. May of 1945 was not a time of liberation, but of absolute confusion. With the collapse of the regime and the entry of the victorious armies, the streets of Germany were transformed into stages of a social decomposition rarely seen. The avenues, once symbols of urban power, were covered with craters, columns of smoke and mountains of rubble that made it impossible to distinguish where a street ended and where the ruins of a house began. Normal traffic had disappeared. Trams, cars, not even bicycles circulated anymore. Only the wandering shadows of thousands of people remained, walking without a fixed direction, searching for whatever they could to survive. The fall of the Reich did not come accompanied by a replacement structure. For years, daily life had been regulated by an omnipresent state apparatus: controls, orders, prohibitions, ration cards. From one day to the next, that apparatus disappeared. Government offices were abandoned, bureaucrats hid or fled, and in their place there was nothing. What dominated was an administrative void that was reflected on every corner. The common citizen no longer knew whom to turn to. There was no recognized authority, and any rule seemed to have lost meaning. In that void, chaos took concrete form. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, and so many other cities became ant-hills of looters. Children of 12 years and old men of 70 entered the remains of destroyed shops to tear off pieces of wood, look for a pair of shoes, or rummage through scorched flour. The black market sprang up on every corner. Cigarettes, hard bread, watches, anything served as currency. Official money was worth nothing. What had value were food, alcohol, medicines, and above all, tobacco. A cigarette was equivalent to a treasure. With a pack one could buy a jacket, a pair of boots, or a sack of flour. Hunger was the engine of chaos. Ration cards, when they existed, barely promised minimal quantities impossible to obtain. improvised kitchens on the streets, fed with bonfires made of furniture or planks torn from bombed houses, boiled pots of watery soup that barely served to trick the stomach. The daily diet was reduced to potatoes, turnips, or bread made with any mixture that could be ground. In the endless lines in front of bakeries, the new social hierarchy could be seen. It did not matter the rank one had held before, all waited under the same cold, all shared the same misery. Looting was not only against shops destroyed by bombings. Abandoned houses, offices, schools, and even churches were invaded by desperate groups. The strongest imposed their presence, and the weak settled for the remains. Many times the looters did not seek food but materials, bricks, tiles, beams that later served to improvise shelters in basements or hollows of destroyed buildings. The urban landscape itself became an open quarry for survival. In Berlin, basements were a separate universe. Entire families lived underground in improvised shelters between collapsed walls. Each room was crammed with mattresses, blankets, kitchen utensils, and memories rescued from destroyed houses. The air was heavy, impregnated with smoke, humidity, and fear. The surface, dominated by Soviet soldiers, was a space of constant risk, especially for women. That is why many chose to spend entire days hidden in tunnels and basements, coming out only in search of food or water. Violence was an inevitable part of that chaos. The discipline that had characterized German society disappeared suddenly. The codes of coexistence broke in a matter of days. It was common to see fights in the middle of the street over a piece of bread, a sack of coal, or a blanket. Theft became routine, and the word property lost meaning. Whoever had something had to defend it tooth and nail. Often, the very occupation soldiers participated in this logic. They requisitioned what they wanted, entered houses and took food, watches, bicycles, radios. The victors moved with absolute authority, and the defeated lacked any defense. The figure of the policeman, the judge, the official had disappeared. In their place, people resorted to improvised community rules. In some neighborhoods, neighbors organized night patrols to protect the little that remained of shops or houses still standing. In others, the strongest imposed their will with violence, transforming the streets into small fiefdoms controlled by gangs. In devastated cities, what emerged was a kind of primitive society where immediate survival was the only law. Desperation was also written on faces. Men returned from the front defeated, barefoot, covered in rags, walking in endless columns toward a home that many times no longer existed. Women carried the burden of sustaining entire families in the midst of devastation. Children, turned into orphans or displaced, wandered in groups looking for something to eat. The collapse had reduced the entire population to the same basic condition, the struggle for one more day of life. The chaos of the streets also had a psychological dimension. For years, propaganda had promised victory, order, discipline. Now the contradiction was total. A country that had conceived itself as a center of power and civilization was reduced to ruins, begging for food on the corners. National pride had dissolved into a sea of humiliation. No one knew what came next, and in that void the present was lived as an endless hell. The children were perhaps the most marked by this environment. Many had grown up listening to speeches of greatness, trained in the Hitler Youth, accustomed to a world of flags and marches. Now they ran among the ruins looking for metal to sell, tearing out cables from rubble, collecting cigarette butts to refill them and smoke. The war had ended, but childhood had disappeared with it. Religion, which in other times had been a spiritual refuge, was also overwhelmed. Destroyed churches, priests who fled or were imprisoned, scattered communities. In some places, parishes served as improvised shelters or as places to exchange news. Boards placed on church doors were filled with handwritten notes. "I am looking for my missing son. Where is my wife?" The Müller family sheltered in such village. The streets were also search boards, a reflection of the family chaos in which millions had lost their loved ones. The dominant feeling was that of abandonment. The death of Hitler had not brought order or liberation, but an even deeper tear. In the streets, the air was impregnated with uncertainty, with the smoke of fires that never finished being extinguished, and with a strange silence interrupted only by screams, distant shots, or the metallic noise of tanks occupying squares. Every corner could be the stage of a tragedy or of a small miracle of survival. It was a country adrift, with its population wandering among the rubble like specters. In that scenario, the chaos of the streets was the first tangible reality after the collapse of the regime. A brutal reality without structure or hope, where each step could mean the difference between life and death. Sexual violence as war booty. The defeat of Germany not only meant the collapse of the regime and the material devastation of its cities, it brought with it one of the darkest and most silenced pages of history, the mass sexual violence against women. As the troops of the Red Army advanced over Berlin and other cities of the East, the military occupation turned into a field of terror where the female body was treated as part of the spoils of war. For millions of German women, the capitulation was not the beginning of peace, but the entrance into a new form of hell. The streets of Berlin, in the first days of May of 1945, were full of rubble, smoke, and fear. Among the ruined buildings moved groups of Soviet soldiers who imposed their absolute dominion. For them, Germany was not only the defeated enemy, it was the territory that had devastated their villages, burned their crops, massacred their families during the Nazi invasion of 1941. Stalinist propaganda had fueled that desire for revenge, and now, in the ruins, it was unleashed with fury. The body of the German woman became a symbol of subjugation and collective punishment. The phenomenon was not isolated nor exceptional. It was massive. Thousands of accounts, personal diaries and later memoirs speak of the same scene repeated again and again. Soldiers breaking into houses, dragging women into rooms, into basements, into courtyards, and subjecting them between the laughter of their comrades or the forced silence of the neighbors. Age did not matter, nor physical condition. Young women of 20 years, elderly women, mothers, girls barely 12, all could be victims. The war had erased limits, and collective revenge did not distinguish between innocent and guilty. Fear permeated every corner of the city. The women knew that going out into the street meant exposing themselves to an almost certain risk. Some disguised themselves with old clothes, smeared their faces with soot or grease to appear older, hoping to go unnoticed. Others hid in basements for days, surviving on crumbs of bread and rationed water, listening to the echo of footsteps on the surface and waiting for them not to come down to look for them. The most desperate established silent pacts, to give themselves to a single soldier, to become a temporary companion, to avoid being raped by dozens. It was a cruel logic, but in the midst of chaos, it meant choosing the lesser evil. In many homes, families tried to defend their women. Fathers, husbands, or brothers stood in the way and almost always were beaten, shot, or reduced to impotence. The Red Army advanced like a torrent impossible to stop, and sexual violence was part of that torrent. It is estimated that millions of women in Germany and Eastern Europe suffered these assaults, in what became one of the most widespread and systematic crimes of the immediate post-war. The trauma was not only physical, but psychological. In societies marked by moral rigidity and the weight of honor, rape was perceived as an indelible stain. Many women, unable to bear the shame, committed suicide. Others hid it for decades, even from their closest families. The military defeat had left scars in the cities. Sexual violence left invisible scars in the soul of an entire generation. The maternity wards also bore witness to this phenomenon. 9 months after the capitulation, German hospitals recorded an abrupt increase in births of children of Soviet soldiers. They were children born of trauma, in many cases rejected by their own communities. The mothers found themselves trapped between the instinctive love for the child and the hatred for the origin of that life. In rural villages, the situation was no different. The soldiers took advantage of their passage through farms and small towns to impose the same pattern of subjugation. The countryside, which many had seen as a refuge from the chaos of the cities, became another stage of violence. The accounts of those days reflect an environment in which sexuality had become a weapon. For the soldiers, it was an act of domination. For the women, an inescapable condemnation. The neighbors, forced witnesses, rarely could intervene. Many limited themselves to looking the other way, aware that any attempt at resistance could cost them their lives. In practice, the entire society was paralyzed, unable to protect its most vulnerable members. In the basements, where thousands sought refuge, the rapes occurred collectively. Soldiers entered in search of women, and those who could not hide were dragged away in front of everyone. The screams mixed with the cries of the children and the powerless silence of the men. The experience of being crowded underground became a constant reminder that safety was impossible. Every noise on the stairs could announce the next assault. Sexual violence was also a tool of dehumanization. For the soldiers, it was not only about satisfying an impulse, but about showing the German population that it no longer had control over anything, not even over its own body. It was victory expressed at the most intimate level possible. By taking possession of the women, the victors symbolically took possession of the entire nation. In that context, silence became a survival strategy. Women who had been assaulted did not speak of it even with their closest relatives. They kept quiet, hardened themselves, tried to move forward as if nothing had happened. But the weight of the experience remained latent, a ghost that accompanied every gesture, every look, every unspoken word. The sexual violence of 1945 was not limited to a moment. It was prolonged as a taboo that conditioned family and social relations for decades. Everyday misery accentuated vulnerability. Many women accepted forced exchanges, food for company, cigarettes for silence. Hunger, cold, and fear formed a triangle that pushed the female population to extreme situations. Dignity became a luxury, and the instinct for survival dominated every decision. The line between imposed violence and conditioned consent became blurred, but in both cases the result was the same: bodies used as currency. The streets reflected that reality in a brutal way. Under Soviet domination, Berlin was plagued with scenes that mixed misery and humiliation. Women walking unsteadily, trying to return to their shelters. Mothers with children in their arms who did not know if the father had died at the front or had been executed for resisting a looting. Young women who carried the weight of multiple assaults and still had to search for food the next day. Defeat was embodied in their bodies, in their lost gaze, in the shared silence of the victims. The stateless refugees. In the months that followed the fall of the Third Reich, the roads of Germany were transformed into endless human rivers. They were not armies, they were not organized columns of soldiers in retreat, they were entire families. Old people who could barely walk, barefoot children, exhausted women carrying improvised bundles with the little they had managed to save. The country, already reduced to ruins by the bombings, was crossed by millions of refugees who wandered without a fixed direction. Their homeland had ceased to exist, and in many cases, their homes had forever remained on the other side of new borders that were drawn on the map with the pencils of the victors. The collapse of 1945 was not only military, it was also geographic. Entire regions, such as East Prussia, Silesia, or the Sudetenland, had been taken from Germany. Their inhabitants were expelled without consideration, pushed onto the road with what they could carry in a backpack, a suitcase, or a rickety wheelbarrow. It was a forced migration of colossal dimensions, one of the greatest human displacements in modern European history, and those who advanced along destroyed roads were the new spectres of the continent, stateless refugees. The scene was repeated in thousands of villages, families interrupted in the middle of the night by curt orders from Soviet soldiers or local militias, forced to abandon their houses in minutes. Many left with the hope of returning in a few weeks when everything calmed down. But the houses would be occupied by new inhabitants, and the keys they carefully kept in their pockets would no longer open any door. For those Eastern Germans, the flight was definitive. The roads became stages of daily tragedies. Endless columns advanced slowly under rain or snow, harassed by hunger and disease. Carts pulled by horses, wheelbarrows and bicycles carried sleeping children, grandmothers wrapped in blankets and sacks of grain that would soon run out. Many walked kilometers with broken shoes or no footwear at all, leaving traces of blood on the frozen ground. At the sides of the roads lay bodies, old people who could not endure, babies dead from cold, mothers who collapsed exhausted with no strength to continue. Every step was a reminder that survival was uncertain. The cities that received the refugees were not prepared for that human flood. Hamburg, Hanover, Munich, or Berlin, already devastated by bombings, had no housing or food sufficient for their own inhabitants. Schools, gyms, destroyed factories, and even churches were filled with improvised mattresses. Basements were crammed with entire families sharing a minimal space, breathing air heavy with smoke and humidity. The newcomers were often seen with distrust by the locals, who perceived them as an additional burden in a country that could no longer support itself. Hunger was the constant in that diaspora. The refugees depended on the leftovers of the black markets, on the improvised charity of peasants, on what they could snatch from half-harvested fields. They were seen collecting roots, rummaging through piles of garbage, chasing any opportunity to get a crust of bread. Food became the new border between life and death, and survival on the road was marked by the ability to obtain it day after day. Uprooting also had a psychological face. Many refugees had grown up in lands their families had inhabited for generations. The fields of Silesia, the houses of Königsberg, the villages of the Sudetenland were part of their identity. Losing those places meant losing not only a home, but the entire memory of a life. In nighttime conversations, while settling into barns or abandoned stations, they spoke with nostalgia of the fruit trees in their yards, of the streets of their villages, of the rivers where they had played as children. All had been left behind, inaccessible, and that past became more painful each day. The refugees also faced hostility. In the western regions, some inhabitants saw them as foreigners within their own country. The competition for resources was fierce, for a sack of potatoes, for a blanket, for a space in a basement. There were conflicts between locals and displaced, fights in food distribution lines, tensions that revealed how deeply German social cohesion had broken. The war had dissolved the idea of community, and in its place emerged a relentless every man for himself. Among the refugees, children were the most vulnerable. Many had lost their parents in the flight or in the bombings and wandered in groups, turned into little vagabonds. They slept in stations, shared what they managed to steal or beg, and lived at the mercy of soldiers or adults they encountered on their way. They were the so-called wolf children, orphans who grew up in the open of the post-war period, learning to survive without school, without home, without family. The winter of 1945 was especially cruel. The displaced improvised shelters with what they found, huts of branches, tents made of torn blankets, walls raised with loose bricks. The cold pierced the bones and multiplied deaths. The corpses of frozen children were found on the sides of the roads, covered by snow. Mothers, unable to give food or warmth, limited themselves to rocking the little ones until they stopped breathing. The flight, which had begun as a forced journey, often turned into a path with no return. In some cities, refugee camps began to multiply. They were places of transit, with overcrowded barracks, endless lines to receive a minimal ration of bread or soup, and diseases that spread easily. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, overcrowding and lack of hygiene turned each camp into a time bomb. However, for many, those places were preferable to the road. At least there was a roof and a promise, however minimal, of survival. Individual stories intertwined with collective tragedy. A woman from Silesia remembered how she had left with 3 children, and only 2 reached the western border. An old man from East Prussia recounted having buried his wife on the side of the road because he could no longer carry her. Young people who had dreamed of the Reich ended up pushing wheelbarrows in silence, not knowing if they would ever see their place of origin again. The diaspora not only erased geographies, it erased identities. Violence accompanied the refugees at every stretch. Not only sexual violence against defenseless women, but also robberies, looting of the little they carried, attacks from soldiers or from other displaced people. The condition of foreigner in your own land made them vulnerable to all kinds of abuses. Many preferred to travel at night, in silence, avoiding main roads, as if they were being hunted. The sound of those human caravans was etched in memory. The screech of wooden wheels, the crying of children, the slow steps on the mud, the groans of the wounded. The landscape was a mosaic of misery, endless columns advancing under a grey sky in a country reduced to dust and hunger. The face of the refugee became one of the most powerful symbols of defeated Germany. They were not combatants nor leaders. They were the forcibly displaced who paid the price of the collapse. Among them were peasants, teachers, artisans, merchants, all expelled from the land where they had been born. They were Germans who no longer had a place to return to. By mid-1945, it was estimated that more than 10 million displaced people traveled the German roads. It was a multitude without a homeland, an exodus that extended from border to border, overwhelming the capacity of any authority. In the midst of the country's ruins, that human mass was the reminder that defeat did not end on the battlefields, but continued in the skin and bones of those who wandered seeking a place to start again. Hunger as a common experience. When the fighting ceased and the cannons fell silent, Germany did not know peace but a new and daily enemy: hunger. The cities reduced to rubble had not only lost their factories, their stations and their homes. They had also lost the ability to feed millions of people crowded among ruins. During the first months after the capitulation, the life of the German population revolved around the desperate search for food in a daily struggle that became the common denominator of all social classes, ages, and regions. The fields of cultivation were devastated. The battles, the advance of tanks, the explosions of artillery had destroyed entire harvests. In the east, many agricultural territories had remained under Soviet control, and the deliveries of grain were destined to supply the Red Army. In the west, the railway transport was collapsed, the bridges destroyed, and the routes interrupted. To manage to move a sack of potatoes from a farm to a city became an almost impossible odyssey. The result was simple. In the cities, there was not enough food for all. Bread, the basic symbol of the German diet, was transformed into a luxury. The bakeries worked with the little they received, mixing low-quality flours, sawdust, or barley to stretch the rations. Each loaf was small, dark, and bitter, and even so the lines extended for hours in front of the shops. Women, elderly people, and children waited in silence, fearful that the goods would run out before their turn came. The previous social rank did not matter. He who had been a civil servant, merchant, or farmer waited in the same line as a widow or an orphan. Hunger made everyone equal. Substitutes became the daily bread. Coffee disappeared immediately, replaced by infusions of chicory, acorns, or toasted roots. Milk was a distant memory. In its place, the children received watery soups made with vegetable scraps or with flour mixed in hot water. Meat was almost non-existent. Once a month, with luck, a piece of sausage or bacon appeared. For many, proteins came from unusual sources: cats hunted in the rubble, stray dogs, pigeons. The line between necessity and taboo blurred with each day of deprivation. In the destroyed neighborhoods of Berlin, the search for food became part of the daily routine. Women risked their lives among collapsed buildings to tear out wood that could then be exchanged for potatoes. Children roamed the streets picking up cigarette butts. Tobacco was currency, and with a couple of cigarettes they could obtain an egg or a piece of bread. The black markets flourished in squares and stations. There, amid the silence broken by quick voices, valuable objects were exchanged for some food. A gold watch could get a few kilos of flour, a jacket could be traded for a handful of turnips. Everything had a price, and that price was paid in food. Hunger also marked bodies. Sunken cheeks, reddened eyes, thin arms became a daily landscape. The doctors, overwhelmed, spoke of a population living in a state of chronic malnutrition. Children grew up rickety with swollen bellies and weak bones. Mothers despaired, seeing that they had no milk to breastfeed, while the babies cried inconsolably. In the hospitals, diseases related to lack of nutrients, tuberculosis, dysentery, typhus, spread quickly. Hunger was more than a biological need. It was an obsession that dominated conversations and decisions. Each day was planned around how to obtain food. Families made calculations to divide a loaf over several days. The displaced and refugees begged in stations and squares, always repeating the same word: brot, brot. In many homes, the only topic at the tables was what had been managed to eat and what remained for the next day. Hunger dictated the rhythm of life. Dignity became relative when it came to surviving. There were women who accepted the company of victorious soldiers in exchange for a tin of canned meat or a pack of cigarettes. There were men who handed over their last family belongings, a ring, a photograph, a radio, to obtain a bag of potatoes. The social hierarchies from before the war disappeared. Hunger placed everyone at the same level of desperation. In the rural villages, the situation was not much better. The peasants, forced to hand over part of their harvests to the occupation forces, were left with the bare minimum. Many hid food in secret barns or underground, fearing seizures. Even so, hunger also reached the villages, especially when they had to host refugees fleeing from the east. Suddenly, a house that before had fed 4 had to support 10 or 12, and the resources were exhausted in days. The children were the most visible bearers of that misery. Groups of little ones roamed stations, stretching out their hands and repeating words in English, Russian, or French, whatever they had managed to learn. Chocolate, bread, please. For the Allied soldiers, handing out candies or biscuits became a habitual gesture, though insufficient in the face of the magnitude of the need. Those children with empty gazes and torn clothes were the rawest mirror of defeat. The cuisine of the post-war was the cuisine of shortage, soups of herbs gathered in wastelands, breads made with strange mixtures, stews where meat was only a memory. In many homes, traditional recipes were lost, replaced by constant improvisation. The important thing was not flavor, but to trick the stomach enough to keep going. The obsession with food came to shape the imagination. In the shelters, while sharing dry loaves or boiled turnips, the adults spoke of past banquets. They remembered in detail a roast, a Christmas table, a cold beer. The children listened to those stories as if they were fantastic tales, accounts of a distant and inaccessible world. In the collective memory, abundance became a dream, a horizon of hope as distant as uncertain. In that devastated landscape, hunger did not distinguish between guilty and innocent, between soldiers and civilians, between young and old. It was the common experience that united all of Germany after defeat. On every corner, in every basement, in every village, the same scene was repeated. Weakened people, empty stomachs, eyes that searched desperately for the next meal. Hunger was the true language of the post-war, the invisible thread that ran through the lives of millions. The moral collapse and the need for adaptation. Defeat was not only military nor material, it was above all a moral collapse. German society, accustomed for more than a decade to living under a system that regulated every aspect of life, suddenly found itself without clear rules, without authorities to trust, and with a devastated landscape in which survival became the only law. In the midst of that void, traditional morality cracked, and people began to improvise new ways of life, sometimes harsh, sometimes cruel, but always dictated by necessity. The iron discipline that had dominated daily life under the Nazi regime disappeared in a matter of days. Rules, uniforms, parades, and speeches had set the rhythm of life in every city and every village. With the surrender, all that turned to dust. The common citizen no longer had anyone to obey nor anyone to fear, beyond the foreign soldiers who patrolled the streets. That absence of structure opened an abyss where old notions of good and evil, of right and wrong, blurred. What had once seemed unthinkable suddenly became possible, even necessary. The first signs of this moral collapse appeared in the most basic matter, survival. Theft, once punished severely, became routine. Women and children looted ruins to get coal, wood, or food. Entire families broke into abandoned farms to take what remained in the storerooms. No one pointed at them, no one judged them. Hunger had erased the weight of the law. The act of stealing was no longer a crime. It was a strategy of life. Prostitution also emerged as a raw response to reality. In occupied cities, many women accepted the company of victorious soldiers in exchange for food, cigarettes, or protection. It was not a marginal phenomenon, but widespread. The sexual morality from before the war, rigid and condemnatory, collapsed under the pressure of hunger and fear. A mother could justify the act of her daughter if it meant bringing home a can of meat or a sack of flour. Necessity prevailed over moral judgment, and what before would have been cause for scandal became a silent pact in order to survive. In basements and shelters, human relationships were transformed. The neighbor was no longer necessarily an ally. In many cases, he was just another competitor in the struggle to obtain resources. Resentment and distrust grew. Families that once shared celebrations now disputed a sack of coal or a space in a room. The collapse had reduced coexistence to a primitive state, where solidarity existed, yes, but limited to the closest circles, family, friends, sometimes a very small network of acquaintances. Beyond that, the law that dominated was that of the strongest. In this context, even religion lost its place as a moral guide. Destroyed churches, scattered pastors, dissolved communities. Faith no longer offered immediate answers to daily misery. Some tried to take refuge in prayer, but most sought concrete and earthly solutions. Sermons about sacrifice and hope seemed distant in the face of hunger and humiliation. Religious morality, which in other times had served as support, was relegated to the background before the brutal urgency of obtaining food, shelter, and security. The moral collapse was also reflected in the way society treated its own children. Once considered symbols of the future, now they were often seen as an unbearable burden. Orphans wandered in groups through stations, sleeping among cardboard and surviving on petty thefts or alms. Some were taken in, but many were ignored by adults who could barely support themselves. The image of a child begging for a piece of bread and being avoided by passers-by was one of the most brutal portraits of that time. Adaptation to these new rules was not always conscious. It was rather instinctive. People learned to read the streets, to identify the soldiers with whom it was convenient to negotiate, to recognize which neighborhoods were more dangerous and which offered some possibility of help. The memory of the previous order remained alive, but each day that passed without real authority pushed it further into oblivion. Little by little, the morality of war was replaced by a morality of necessity, a system of unwritten rules where what mattered was not what was right, but what was useful. Accounts from that time show scenes that condense this transformation: a woman exchanging her wedding ring for a sack of flour, a teenager stealing coal from a train to warm his family, neighbors hiding food while others starved on the same street. It was not pure evil, but adaptation. The war had turned everyone into survivors, and survival required absolute pragmatism. The moral collapse also affected the relationship between victors and vanquished. Allied soldiers, especially in the West, were seen with a mixture of fear and desire. They represented power, authority, but also access to scarce goods: chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, canned meat. Many women sought protection in relationships with soldiers, relationships that oscillated between coercion, convenience, and, in some cases, genuine affection. For German society, marked by defeat, these unions were a source of resentment and contradictory moral judgments. While some condemned them, others understood that in those relationships lay the difference between life and death. The need for adaptation reached even the language. Foreign words began to infiltrate daily speech, reflecting the influence of the occupiers. Children learned to say chocolate in English or Kleb in Russian before they could read and write in German. The language of the victors became one more tool to get food or protection. Language itself adapted to the new reality. Traditional morality based on obedience and order was buried under the rubble. In its place emerged a pragmatic, raw, immediate ethic. What mattered was surviving the day, protecting your own, obtaining the bare minimum. In the midst of the ruins, each person reinvented themselves according to circumstances. Some did it with harshness, others with cunning, others with resignation. What they all shared was the certainty that the known world had disappeared, and that to move forward they had to learn to live in another way. The Allies and the occupation. When the echo of the cannons faded and the flag with the swastika was torn from the official buildings, defeated Germany ceased to be a sovereign country. What remained of its cities and its people was left under the absolute control of the victors. The Allies did not enter as liberators but as masters of the new order, and the occupation became the daily experience of millions of Germans. The foreign boots, the military vehicles, and the signs in unknown languages came to mark the rhythm of life in a country that had lost the right to decide for itself. The division was immediate. Germany was split into 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, American, British, and shortly afterward French. Each sector had its own rules, its own commands, and its own way of administering defeat. In the East, the Red Army imposed an iron regime: confiscations, mass arrests, and a climate of constant fear. In the West, the British and Americans established a more bureaucratic administration, marked by rationing, military control, and the initial reconstruction. The life of the Germans varied radically depending on the invisible border that divided a neighborhood or a region. The streets reflected this new reality. Allied soldiers patrolled with absolute authority. They could requisition homes to set up barracks, evict entire families, or confiscate automobiles and bicycles. Civilians had to show documents at every step, respond to interrogations, and obey curfews. The sensation of being under permanent surveillance was part of daily life. Defeat was lived on every corner, in every contact with the foreign uniforms that were no longer war enemies but masters of the post-war. The Allied soldiers were not all the same in their treatment of the population. In the West, many Germans discovered with surprise that the Americans, unlike the Soviets, handed out rations of chocolate or cigarettes to the children. Those minimal gestures were seen as extraordinary luxuries amid widespread hunger. However, along with curiosity and sympathy, there were also abuses: looting of homes, rapes, and an arbitrary use of authority. For the defeated, the relationship with the occupiers oscillated between gratitude and resentment, between dependence and fear. In the Soviet zone, the occupation was much harsher. Revenge dominated every gesture. Looting was systematic. Industrial machinery dismantled and sent to the Soviet Union, train wagons loaded with materials, entire factories taken apart. The Soviets did not only seek to control the territory, they wanted to rip out at the root any possibility that Germany might rise again. To this was added terror. Mass arrests of those accused of collaborating with the regime, summary executions, deportations to camps in the east. For civilians, living in the Soviet zone meant learning to survive under a power that acted with brutality and without accountability. Daily life was ruled by curfews. In the cities, after a certain hour, the streets were deserted under threat of arrest. The windows remained dark, the radios were seized, and public gatherings were forbidden. The occupation reduced social life to the private sphere, to what happened in homes and basements. To speak aloud, to express political opinions, or to show signs of nostalgia for the regime could mean prison or something worse. Women once again occupied a central place in the new dynamic. In many households, they were responsible for negotiating with the Allied soldiers, for seeking food in the black markets, for caring for children amid uncertainty. Some established relationships with soldiers to obtain protection or resources. They were unions viewed with mistrust by neighbors, but tolerated in silence because often they meant the difference between survival and hunger. The occupation in that sense penetrated even into the intimacy of homes, shaping bonds and breaking taboos. The process of denazification was another facet of the occupation. The Allies established tribunals and forms to determine who had been a member of the party and to what degree. Millions of Germans went through interrogations and classification processes that determined whether they could work in administration, in teaching, or in industry. For many, fear did not end with defeat. A stage of uncertainty began in which any neighbor could denounce them, and any past, however small, could become a reason for sanction. The Allied control also extended to food and transport. Rationing was administered directly by the military authorities. Each citizen received ration cards stamped by foreign offices, and the food arrived under the strict gaze of the victors. The trains, monitored and controlled, transported not only provisions, but also millions of displaced people who were distributed into camps or already overloaded cities. Life, which had once been regulated by a German totalitarian state, was now regulated by a system of foreign control that penetrated every aspect of routine. In the West, the Germans began to become familiar with unknown words and customs. The children learned to ask for chewing gum or chocolate in English. The signs in the streets, written in 2 languages, reminded them that they lived in a conquered country. In the East, Russian became the language of command, and the portraits of Stalin began to occupy the walls where once had been Hitler. German identity dissolved among foreign languages and symbols. The contact with the soldiers also left cultural traces. In the American zones, jazz music, swing records, and Hollywood films began to filter into daily life. For many young people, they were a window to a different, bright world, opposed to the darkness in which they had lived. In the East, on the other hand, Soviet art and propaganda began to shape public life with parades, red flags, and collective slogans. The occupation was not only military, it was cultural, and little by little it began to shape the future of Germany. Resentment, however, was always present. Many Germans did not distinguish between Soviet, American, British, or French occupiers. All were foreigners who had taken their country. In private conversations whispered, they spoke of the humiliation of being governed by others, of the shame of showing documents to young soldiers who did not even speak German. National pride was wounded, and the occupation was a constant reminder of that wound. The landscape of the occupation was a mixture of fear, dependence, and adaptation. In the streets, the Allied uniforms blended with the ruins. Military trucks rolled through avenues where hungry children asked for candies. Improvised offices handed out ration cards while German prisoners returned on foot from the front, exhausted and defeated. The German flag had disappeared, and in its place flew those of the victors. The occupation was not a brief parenthesis, but the new normal. Millions of Germans grew up with the certainty that their lives were ruled by decisions taken in English, in Russian, or in French. The country no longer belonged to them, and while the rubble was slowly removed and the cities tried to be reborn, the foreign boots continued marking the beat of every step. Rebuilding among the ruins. After the capitulation, Germany was a country turned into a cemetery of stone. Entire cities lay beneath mountains of broken bricks and twisted beams. The avenues had been transformed into passages of dust, where the wind lifted ashes that seemed endless. The urban landscape was no longer recognizable. What had once been a theater, a school, or a church was now a heap of rubble, where barely any traces of previous life remained. In that desolate setting began a silent and titanic process, reconstruction. The first task was not to raise new houses, but to clear the land. Millions of tons of rubble blocked streets, squares, and stations. There was not enough machinery, nor specialized personnel, nor resources. It was above all women who began the work. With scarves on their heads, improvised gloves, and rusty shovels, they began to lift brick after brick, to push wheelbarrows, and to stack remains in organized piles. They were called Trümmerfrauen, the women of the rubble, and they became a symbol of daily resistance. Their task was infinite, to clean a city that had been buried under its own ruins. The work was done with bare hands, with metal buckets, and with the strength of bodies exhausted by hunger. Day after day, the improvised crews pulled out blackened stones, collected charred pieces of wood, and separated what could still be reused: whole bricks, beams, pieces of windows. The piles of rubble became artificial mountain ranges, hills of ruins that dominated the horizon. Years later, many parks and green spaces would be built on those mountains of waste. In 1945, they were visible scars of the disaster. Transport was another obstacle. Without enough trucks, the rubble was moved in horse-drawn carts, adapted bicycles, or even hand carts. Children and old people collaborated in the task, forming human chains that passed bricks from one hand to another. It was a collective effort in which there was no space for rest. Each cleared street meant that the tram could pass again, that a market could reopen, that the city breathed a little more. Housing was an urgency. Millions of people slept in basements, destroyed stations, or improvised shelters. Roofs were repaired with whatever was available: tin sheets, military tarps, doors torn from other houses. In many half-destroyed buildings, families occupied one habitable room while the rest remained in ruins. It was common to see curtains hanging in the middle of open walls, improvised kitchens in corners where windows had once been, chimneys standing alone in the middle of emptiness. Privacy had been lost. Living among ruins meant being exposed to cold, to noise, and to the gaze of all. The lack of electricity and running water forced primitive solutions. Improvised wells, stoves made of rusty barrels, candles, and oil lamps marked the daily life of the survivors. The smoke mixed with the dust of the rubble, soaking clothes and bodies. Reconstruction was not only a physical effort, it was also a struggle against winter, against disease, and against despair. Cities slowly began to organize community brigades. In entire neighborhoods, neighbors gathered to clean a street together, to raise an improvised bridge, or to repair a roof. Solidarity, which had been broken during the war, reappeared at certain moments as a spark of humanity. However, selfishness remained. While some worked, others preferred to devote themselves to the black market or to looting. Reconstruction moved between these two poles: collective cooperation and individual survival. In rural villages, reconstruction had a different character. Destroyed farms were repaired with wood from nearby forests, and entire families participated in the raising of barns and pens. The goal was to return to food production as soon as possible. The war had emptied pantries, and each harvest was vital. The hands that had once been at the front now gripped hoes and hammers, trying to restore the countryside's capacity to feed the country. In the cities, reconstruction also meant recovering basic services. Public transport began to function again partially. Rickety trams traveled avenues full of holes. Improvised buses transported workers to half-destroyed factories that began to reopen. Hospitals tried to reorganize in damaged buildings, with beds lined up in rooms without windows and with doctors working without rest. Improvised schools arose in basements and warehouses, where teachers taught groups of children sitting on benches made of salvaged wood. Commerce, though weak, reappeared. In the midst of the ruins, street markets multiplied. They were not fairs of abundance, but improvised tables with some potatoes, used clothing, rusty tools. Barter became the main form of exchange. a jacket for a kilo of flour, a watch for a sack of coal. Official bills had lost their symbolic value. Real money was food, tobacco, and fuel. The sound of reconstruction began to impose itself over the silence of destruction. The hammering of nails, the screech of handsaws, the noise of wheelbarrows full of rubble mixed with the voices of those who worked shoulder to shoulder. Although progress was slow, each wall raised and each street cleared represented a small triumph over the magnitude of the devastation. The urban landscape began to show signs of transformation. Among destroyed buildings, improvised houses arose, built with brick remains and tin roofs. In squares, the piles of rubble became improvised playgrounds for children who ran among ruins as if they were castles. The destroyed city began to turn into a habitable, though precarious, place. Winter tested those advances. Improvised roofs collapsed under snow, homemade stoves filled rooms with smoke, and diseases spread quickly. Reconstruction was a race against climate, against hunger, and against accumulated exhaustion. However, each family found strength in the minimal hope that tomorrow would be a little less hard than yesterday. Rebuilding among the ruins was not only raising walls, it was also rebuilding routines. Church bells, when they still existed, timidly rang again. Factories began to organize work shifts. Markets opened and closed at regular hours. Little by little, people again marked time, establishing a rhythm of life. It was not the normality of before the war, but a new order born among the scars of disaster. The image of women with shovels, of children carrying bricks, of men dragging beams through destroyed streets became the symbol of a nation trying to rise from its own ashes. Reconstruction was slow, painful, and uneven, but it was also the first step so that millions of people could once again call themselves inhabitants of a city and not only survivors of a field of ruins. The bells of May of 1945 did not mark the beginning of peace, but the beginning of a long silence. Germany had been reduced to a skeleton of stone, smoke, and hunger. It was not a country but a fractured territory, occupied, marked by scars that crossed both its cities and the souls of its inhabitants. Among the rubble, millions of people wandered with lost gazes, carrying with them the weight of defeat, guilt, and uncertainty. The death of Hitler had torn out the center of the regime, but it did not offer answers. What followed was a void, without a leader, without a defined homeland, without horizon. Daily life became an exercise of resistance against misery. Eating, sleeping under a roof, keeping the family together were goals that seemed unattainable. Traditional morality had collapsed, and in its place arose new rules, harsh, pragmatic, imposed by the immediate need to survive. Foreign occupation became the new normal. The uniforms of the victors marked every street, every square, every movement. The country was divided not only into administrative borders but into opposing realities. The Soviet East under the shadow of revenge and strict control, the Anglo-American West wrapped in the ambiguity of humiliation and hope. On both sides, the present was uncertain ground where the population had to adapt to the authority of others, to learn strange languages, to get used to symbols that were not their own. And yet among the ruins, life did not stop. Hunger pushed women to search for bread in black markets, children to collect cigarette butts to sell, old people to form chains of hands passing brick after brick. Cities began to breathe again thanks to those who had nothing more to offer than their physical effort. Each wall raised, each street cleared, each school improvised in a basement was a small victory over devastation. The country that had promised 1,000 years of glory had consumed itself in barely 12. Of that grandiloquent promise, only widows, orphans, refugees, and rubble remained. But in that very ruin, something new began to take shape. An instinct for survival that no longer depended on political slogans nor speeches of power, but on the individual and collective will not to surrender. The years that followed would transform that pain into a process of reconstruction, into a search for a different identity. But in 1945, in the months immediately after the fall of the regime, the only certain thing was shared misery, exposed human fragility, and the slow adaptation to an unknown reality. Life after Hitler did not begin with flags nor with celebrations, but with hands dirty with dust, with empty stomachs, with tears, and with silence. A silence that among the ruins marked the true beginning of the post-war.